I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong and then they sue you for perjury. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to. But the judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. In other words, you could go into every single thing that I ever did. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? And my lawyer said, what do you need to go through? And all you wanted to do is testify simply on this case. Because I would have loved to have testified. To this day, I would have liked to have testified. But you would have said something out of whack, like it was a beautiful sunny day and it was actually raining out.
Yeah, I'm sure that would have been the case. That's Donald Trump from his press conference this morning, of course, the day after he was convicted on all 34 charges in his hush money trial in New York. And by the way, he went on to talk about being under a gag order, and I'm going to ask our guest about this in a sec. But listen to this. This is Trump again about being under this gag order.
Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines and was threatened with jail. Think of it. I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by a lot, and I'm leading the Republicans to the point where that's over. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put two sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people. Maybe his people more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything.
Okay. As only Donald Trump could do it, I guess. Mark Cohen is on the line. He's a former New York City prosecutor turned veteran criminal defense lawyer. Mr. Cohen, thank you for your time this afternoon. Let me begin perhaps going back to yesterday when we found out that he had been found guilty on all those charges, and then ask you today this idea about him testifying, and he wanted to testify, he had threatened to testify. Would it have made a difference, do you think, in this trial?
Well, first of all, Aaron, thank you for having me. No, I don't think it would have made a difference. In my mind, the case, in essence, would rise or fall. At least this is what I thought going in on the documentary evidence. And sure enough, the documentary evidence was so damning, including handwritten notes, grossing up taxes for purposes of making or disguising the transaction. If it was only testimony, sure, it's word against word. But in my mind, the documentary evidence sealed the deal, no matter whether he testified or not.
So I will then ask, with respect to what happens next, and that's what everybody is, of course, wondering. July 11th will be sentencing, but a lot will happen between now and then. If I read right, is Trump at this point actually going to be asked to meet with the probation officer?
Not asked, he's directed to. Let me explain. In the New York State system, the probation department is responsible for creating a pre-sentencing report that the judge will rely on in fixing sentence. Now, the pre-sentencing report results from an interview. The thing here is, and what makes this particularly difficult for this defendant, is that no lawyer is permitted to attend the probation interview with their client in New York State. As a result, the client will be in there by himself or herself and fending for himself or herself in terms of how to answer questions. Now, we've all seen Mr. Trump, and, one of the mandatory questions will be, do you accept responsibility for your actions? Can you comment on your guilt or innocence? And I think it's fair to say that it's doubtful that he would accept responsibility for his acts and therefore invite a judge to consider a more lenient sentence. By the same token, judges in New York are famous when they believe that someone is not admitting to the same guilt that they do when they plead guilty. They're famous for enhancing sentences. Judges are required to warn a defendant when they plead guilty that they have to continue to act in the same manner as when they enter their declaration. And if they start to backtrack on their guilt, then I can tell you that it can get ugly. So for somebody like Trump, if I was advising him, I would say to him, listen, if they ask you if you want to comment on acceptance of responsibility or on the facts of the case, stay mute and say no thank you, but don't start complaining that it's rigged, etc.
Okay, as I hear you say that, I think to myself, I could see that for most people, but I can't possibly see that for Donald Trump. If you're going to ask him that, really, I mean, I just, that can't happen. It won't happen.
It won't, and that's the point. So then the question, the burden kind of shifts back to Judge Merchan, right? Because then Judge Merchan, you know, I'm sure he expects that, you know, there'll be some kind of diatribe like that, right? But it'll be up to him to really, really have to bear down and not use that as a decisive fact, you know, in his thinking.
So let's talk about a penalty here, because a lot of people are wondering now what's going to happen. It's unlikely he will be sentenced to jail. You know, in the old story, he'd be a first-time offender. He's 70 some odd years old. What do you imagine the sentencing here will look like?
Well, I'll be honest. I would never have thought that he would have gone to jail, but for the fact that he's been found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of 10 violations of the gag order. That's contempt, right? And every comment he makes, everything he says, violations of the gag order or not. I mean, the man is a nuclear weapon on the criminal justice system. And one thing that Judge Merchan must consider as one of the elements one of the factors that he has to consider in sentencing is respect for the law. So, as a result of that, I believe that what we lawyers in New York City call a taste of jail might be forthcoming. So maybe a 30-day sentence, a 60-day sentence, a 90-day sentence. And by the way, you only serve 2/3 of the sentence. So if it's a 60-day sentence, you serve 40 days. Anything under a year in New York City, you do 2/3. You get automatic good time off. But the point is to perhaps promote respect for the law, and another factor, to stop him from violating the law further. Sometimes you have to decapacitate somebody, and that would mean incarcerating them in whatever setting.
So you're describing a situation, if I understand it, where outside of the 34 convictions for fraud here, his repeated violation of the gag order and basically, being held in contempt of court here, even though he paid, I think it was $1,000 fine every time he was told he was in contempt, that, if the judge should decide was serious enough, could actually end up with him in jail.
100%.
Wow. Okay. I would ask you the other question, which is, okay, even if that's the case, do you imagine that will happen in this case?
Well, I think one thing that you need to kind of keep in mind is no one's going to Rikers Island if they're the former president of the United States. And, I don't know that they would put him in a hotel either. What I've seen happen in my career, I'll give you an example. I've had situations where the feds have a significant interest in someone the state is prosecuting. I represented a gentleman who was sentenced federally first, received time served, and then had to face sentencing in the state system. Well, that state judge incarcerated him. The feds had the United States Marshals in the state courtroom. And when my client was remanded to custody, the feds jumped in with a warrant, handed it to the court staff in New York State, and took custody of my client, and then they took him into federal custody in jail, and the Bureau of Prisons housed him where he completed his state sentence.
Okay.
So in my mind, what I think would likely happen is he'd wind up serving his time, if sentenced to time, in a federal facility.
July 11th, that's the date. Now, is there a chance that could either be moved up or moved down? I mean, there's obviously going to be an appeal here, but it doesn't have anything to do with the sentencing, does it?
No.
Okay.
Well, the answer is typical practice. Yeah, it could get adjourned. There's been Countless times I've been in court for a sentencing proceeding only to be advised that the probation department hasn't completed the report. They need another week. Case adjourned.
Okay.
Not in this one. I would imagine that they'll pick a special officer, and I would imagine that officer will have this report done in lightning speed.
How would you like to be Donald J. Trump's probation officer? I just love the sound of that. Mark Cohen, former New York City prosecutor, thank you so much for your time.